It's a special pleasure to be here in person to join an intellectual fellowship with the RaceB4Race crew and everyone who took time to be here this morning. I'm very grateful. I'll also say that it's my first time at this gathering, and it's been nothing short of inspiring to hear the presentations thus far. It's really moving to see and feel things done with such conscientious attention to equity and inclusivity. Needless to say, if more conferences were like this, I probably would avoid them with such a passion. So, I know that you are all dying to hear about this late medieval Jesuit racism. I've come for the intellectual fellowship and honeydew melon and stay for the racist Jesuit shenanigans. But we'll get there. But first, I want to take a step back and expand on the note of gratitude, because it feels really important and also pertinent to articulate explicit and implicit themes in this talk. Which is to say, I want to express gratitude as a gesture of rigorous critical engagement and to undermine any pretensions towards singular intellectual achievement. So yesterday's slew of insights and great vibes, shocking, had me in my feelings. And after the Jericho Brown-Fred Moten conversation in particular, which followed on Suzanne Foley's truly transformative presentation of her craft, I felt golden, or more like having been gifted permission I hadn't asked for but sorely needed. To reframe what felt like a competent but ultimately less authentic presentation of some newer research on premodern Japanese performance. So this is an experiment, and I'm glad to have you here. Therefore, I'm going to try to say some things as efficiently as possible because you have all made me feel more comfortable saying them. All I can promise is that they will be difficult and interesting and offered in the spirit of reciprocity. So, part one. So this is my first of these conferences. Yes.
Can you guys control it from back there? Can you move it back?
Okay.
The next one.
Thank you so much.
Next time.
Thanks, Tom. So this talk will be split into three parts: gratitude and grounding, what ignorance is nonsense, and then racist Jesuit poetics in the service of the Japanese world. I want to say this is this is my first time at this conference, and I was honored to be invited, but I was very wary due to the pandemic. My mom is in chemo right now, and I'm trying to be vigilant, so I hope for an online option, and I hope that will be available. Professor Anna Thompson was kind and insistent, and I thought I've been out running the room for 2.9 years, and now I'm doomed. But I eventually decided to join the gathering mainly because I had to confront myself and say, Reggie, these other folks got you out to play Mario Kart with your life on a daily basis, and you slide right into the routine, but you won't risk it for folks who are far smarter and far more invested in your contributions. Stop playing with the flow. So you were right, and I think I didn't. Yeah, it was in that context, I want to say I didn't realize how tired I was, how existentially weary I have been made by the academy and the world that it refracts until I got here. The sensation is not unlike that ambrosial, eye-watering, soul-molting foot rub Settler receives in Beloved, but something on that wavelength at least. Indoors, not out, less fraught, but comparably visceral. I had the pleasure of soaking up all the energy of yesterday's and this morning's glorious program, and it unsettled me to the root in a wonderfully chilling way. I got real kicked in the chest with what I apparently had been missing, and it was delicious and vertiginous with an inkling of the life-altering. To echo a note of Jericho Brown's remarks last night, I realized that what I experienced was a queer encounter. Not queer in the vernacular sense per se, but rather queer in the way that Sarah Ahmed highlights in Queer Phenomenology, Orientations, Objects, Others. There, she develops her notion of queerness in relation to a disorientation Maurice Merleau-Ponty explains as involving not just, quote, the intellectual experience of disorder, but the vital experience of giddiness and nausea, which is the awareness of our contingency and the horror with which it fills us, end quote. So my question to start is, how should we understand this disorganizing yet invigorating awareness of contingency as we feel it on a daily basis? The embodied experience of uncertainty, apprehension, and vulnerability as it shapes our intellectual work and our lives more broadly. How does this queerness condition the questions we tend to ask or talk ourselves out of asking? So, great. Oh, yeah. Just one, please. That's your one. Just one of it, yeah, sorry. There you go, great, thank you. My first book was about mourning and medieval Japanese calligraphic performance, and my second book, which I'm showing here the cover of, as it turns out, was also about mourning. But I thought that the implications, I thought through the implications of Ahmed's theorization for premodern Japanese literature, and it was about intimacy and loss. For what it's worth, the book is open access, so just you can read the preface in chapter 1 and the conclusion and be fine. But I want to say that besides keeping my therapist gainfully employed, this personal repetition compulsion has value, I believe, that can be translated into our current discussion. Namely, that at its base, mourning embodies a critical praxis of reckoning with enduring attachments as one attempts to move forward. And I think about that in the academy, but also for some of the historical actors I'm thinking about in the Jesuit context. To inhabit the academy is at some level to inhabit a site of mourning, where the drive toward disciplinary expertise and credentialing demands a death in small doses of parts of ourselves deemed uncouth, excessive, in need of being permed, policed, or is it polished, down to a porcelain finish. The tincture of hemlock and the microaggressive Merlot poured for you at that optional mandatory wine and cheese designed to improve department climate. Aspiration, fleeing whatever shadows us to locate a semblance of material security, can make us murder ourselves in increments that sting like paper cuts earned in university libraries you perpetually need ID to nap in. So thank you all for helping me mourn a scholarly incarnation of myself that has both served me well over the past 2 decades or so, at a superficial level at least, but also exacted its pound of flesh time and time again. Here's to whatever is generated in the wake. So on that note, I want to invoke Christina Sharp's insights in their resonance with something Jericho Brown mentioned yesterday about a kind of queer attunement reminiscent of Du Bois's second sight, born of double consciousness, or the capacity to peer beyond the veil, a capacity to see things others might miss and to create in powerful ways. Sharp writes, quote, "As we go about wake work, we must think through containment, regulation, punishment, capture, and captivity, and the ways the manifold representations of blackness become the symbol par excellence for the less than human being condemned to death. We must think about black flesh, black optics, and ways of producing enfleshed work. Think the ways the hold cannot and does not hold, even as the hold remains in the form of the semiotics of the slave ship hold, the prison, the womb, and elsewhere in and as the tension between being and instrumentality that is black being in the wake. At stake is not recognizing anti-blackness as total climate. At stake, too, is not recognizing an insistent black visual sonic resistance to that imposition of non-being. How might we stay in the wake with and as those whom the state positions to die ungrievable deaths and live lives meant to be unlivable? These are questions of temporality, the longue durée, the residence and whole time of the wake. At stake, then, is to stay in this wake time toward inhabiting a blackened consciousness that would rupture the structural silences produced and facilitated by, and that produce and facilitate, black social and physical death. For if we are lucky, we live in the knowledge that the wake has positioned us as no citizen. If we are lucky, the knowledge of this positioning avails us particular ways of re-seeing, re-inhabiting, and reimagining the world. All of it, but that last part in particular. I couldn't help but think of Suzanne Coley's work in this context. Suzanne, I should say that your presentation fully melted my brain. So please blame Suzanne for any of the discombobulation you detect today. I am an artist, but still fairly closeted in that identity, because I've known that the people who savor the job of judging my fitness for this field and serve as the arbiters of my professional fate can't handle the fullness of my creativity, to say nothing of my humanity. But seeing your craft and courage to do your own thing shook something loose. Girl, you made me want to up and quit my job and learn how to sew. I'm not quite there yet, But your stunning example is nudging me along. I've always been cheered to share this work in such a setting, but here are just some images. Yeah, and because, yeah. So I want to thank you, Suzanne, for, I haven't done this before, so anyway. So if we are lucky, that refrain rang in my head last night. I think we are lucky to witness the gift of Suzanne's artistry in this communal space, that interface with an unapologetic art making enacts that undercommons impulse to celebrate a communal intellectuality as we bask in the light of impeccable craft, guided by authentic, unapologetic humanity and a degree of rigor none of the gatekeepers we encounter could dream of matching with their self-congratulatory, allegedly dispassionate, so-called critique. It ain't a contest, but there's levels to this ish, and what a blessing to be able to sing happy birthday before theorizing through the tenderly wrought materiality of sequins and sonnets. So following on Professor Brandy K. Adams' invigorating presentation and stress on what we lose when we bow to the often clueless but still heavily subsidized governing mandates of capital H history, I want to take that predicament seriously as a problem for thought about the university, about the institutionality of our embodiment, and various labors on behalf of or in spite of the university, about, in other words, our relation to our jobs and our relation to our work. So I'm used to worrying about how to make my boutique predilections toward Japanese culture more legible and accessible to a broader audience. That's not as much of an issue with you guys, because many of you are pre-modernists in the house, but it's still a thing when I reach into my trunk of semi-ancient Asian curios. So in thinking about what connects us, besides our gradations of alienation from our fields and institutions, I want to think a little bit about the current moment and then use that as a pivot back to the kind of pre-modern era. And here I'm thinking about Derricka Purnell's really awesome book, Becoming Abolitionists. Some of you might know it. There she is, smiling. And in this context, not just because of what was released last night and other forms of state violence that we've become too accustomed to, I was thinking about kind of what it means to be in the academy, and I think this resonates with some of the things that were said yesterday about things like travel grants. And Derricka says, you can read it, but basically thinking about what it means to be in the academy and continue to be exploited by people who benefit from capitalism and generational wealth. Along these lines, I think it's important to understand that, as we scrape by and try to kind of avoid precarious employment and fund things like DEI initiatives or things like this, that my current university, the University of Michigan, has spent $500 million for a different kind of white ignorance, frankly, in terms of sexual abuse by Richard Anderson over the course of 4 decades. So when we're thinking about kind of expenditure of resources and the types of rhetoric that happen to be used, the poesy that comes in full force around why something can't be done or can't be done right now, I think we should think about this material kind of set of circumstances as well. So, that in mind, I want to say the following, namely that for part 2 here, think about white ignorance as nonsense. And what I want to say to start is that all of us in this room, regardless of our background or disciplinary training, are the products, inheritors, and purveyors of white ignorance, very often despite ourselves. Now, before you nibble a fingernail or reach for a cigarette, I want to emphasize that I posit this not to kindle any self-loathing or shame, but rather to establish the grounds for a collective thought exercise that takes up white ignorance as an epistemological problem, and more often than not, as an institutional imperative. And I'd like to suggest, to kind of, in case I run out of time, that I want to try to posit white ignorance, moreover, as potentially a transhistorical concept that might help us do critical work. Indeed, as I understand its origins, Race4Race's emergence owes much to white ignorance as a productive force, in opposition to which rich seeds of intellectual sociality could be planted, in terms of being shut out, in terms of trying to find other spaces to do interesting work. So with Foucault's notion of a history of the present in mind, I find it hard to consider the pre-modern Jesuits outside of this contemporary scenario. So, in this, I guess I should say, I have a lot of people in mind. Obviously, always Sylvia Wynter in terms of thinking about so 1492, but then also NHI, a letter to my colleagues, and these kinds of things as well. So I think that what I have in mind, too, is what Fred Moden and Stefano Harney say when they observe about the Undercommons, that one of its hardest tasks is actually to abolish the policeman inside of us, right? Alongside things that Miriam Kaba and Derek Tormel might say about kind of abolishing the police. So white ignorance, or why, as I'm abbreviating it, poses a question, I think. It is not ironclad, but it is reliable, like being able to rely on a McDonald's bathroom when you travel abroad. It is excellent, quoting here and thinking about Bill Reddings and the University in Ruins, the notion of excellence as an empty signifier. It's excellent in the way that Ron DeSantis is an excellent governor, or Eric Adams is an excellent mayor, or Hakeem Jeffries' inheritance of Pelosi's position heralds an excellent relationship with Israel. So part 2 of my talk, is really trying to think about kind of how to take up black feminist insights and methods and kind of think about them, use them to do some work in the context of that seems to be quite allergic to black feminist research methods, which is, say, pre-modern Japanese literary studies specifically. So my goal today is to consider the case of 16th century Japan within a global project of evangelization whose racialization trafficked in human bodies in tandem with the proliferation of racist tropes and linguistic practices. So I'm trying to think about rhetorical performance and white ignorance as a vehicle to get towards white innocence as it relates to the serviceability of Japanese bodies and voices to Christian race-making. Along these lines, some of you are probably well familiar with these, so I'll move relatively quickly, but I have in mind Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racism, Charles Mills's notion of white ignorance, and then Caretha Mitchell's notion of white mediocrity and know your place aggression. And if there's any gem that I can give to you, a jewel that I can use to repay, if you haven't read Professor Caretha Mitchell's article, I would highly recommend doing that. It will lighten your load. So first of all, according to Gilmore, racism is a state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Fair enough. Charles Mills and Caretha Mitchell here. So as a kind of, not just a meme, but as a figure of white ignorance, the kind of, that whole thing, the kind of credulity and the knowing smile seems to me is important to kind of keep in mind, because particularly in terms of anticipating some of the rhetorical moves the Jesuits are making with regard to having effectively these Japanese boys as apologists for slavery, and as particularly, I'd say, valuable apologists in both their proximity to whiteness as being kind of designated as gente blancas, or kind of white people, in contradistinction to los indios and los negros, right, in the New World. But then also in terms of being styled as particularly obedient, particularly attractive, particularly in the terms of kind of respectability politics, particularly attractive in the way that they kind of invite a certain kind of avuncular relation from these Christian men. So here's Charles Mills on white ignorance. He says in a 2007 essay, I set out to map a non-knowing grounded specifically in white racial privilege. My discussion and the essay was focused mainly on the United States, but I intended the application of the concept to be much broader. Insofar as the modern world has been created by European colonialism and imperialism, and insofar as racist assumptions, frameworks, norms were central to the theories justifying white Western conquest and domination of that world, we would expect white ignorance to be global. Modernity is supposed to be illuminated by the Enlightenment, but as numerous books on the Enlightenment have pointed out in recent decades, it was an enterprise cognitively compromised from the start. And I love that phrase, the cognitive compromised nature of this particular kind of episteme. The political economy of racial domination required a corresponding cognitive economy that would systematically darken the light of factual and non-native inquiry. End quote. So although Mills's main concern is with the modern period, I'm interested in how the cognitive economy he describes and the linguistic economy that's related to it might affect our sense of the earlier periods and perspectives. If, as Mills asserts, the Enlightenment was, quote, cognitively compromised from the start, then I'd like to consider a late medieval moment before that start in order to theorize race-making in Japan. call it a prehistory of white ignorance, which calls for a genealogical reading of the rhetorical nature of white nonsense. So by white nonsense here, I invoke the vernacular notion of the term nonsense, but I also want to emphasize how early modern attempts to advance a white supremacist worldview rely upon justifications of domination that struggle to make sense, to cohere logically. This inability to make sense stems not just from the inescapable insincerity of those justifications, but also from the desire to posit a world wherein the precarious nature of white dominance was disavowed. White nonsense here is stitched together from comedy, fantasy, various genres, and partakes of a particular poesy designed to render anti-blackness not just as sensible, but as essential to an understanding of the Christian and racial capitalism. This is nonsense insofar as it exceeds the constitutive confines of truth or falsity to indulge the performative. So I want to think about the performative nature of white nonsense. So specifically, I'll examine the case of Jesuit Japan and ways in which young male Japanese converts to Christianity are deployed within the Jesuit imaginary to perform rhetorical work. And this is work that, as Romulo Halt talks about in his really magisterial study of Jesuits and Japanese slavery, this is work that stems from their work as slaves, so boy as a euphemism for slave. Valignano, who I'll talk about soon, is a slave owner, slave trafficked through the Jesuit kind of trade networks. But then also, the importance of these Japanese boys as figures, rhetorical figures in the literature. So, I'd like to kind of suggest, and looking forward, that pre-modern Japanese studies offers an especially rich space in which to consider how the overlapping operations of white supremacy, white ignorance, and white mediocrity condition disciplinary knowledge. And I suspect that some of these things might also apply to your respective disciplines and fields. Along these lines, then, I want to think about the epistemological implications of white ignorance as an engine of knowledge production, vital for the reproduction of the field, both disciplinarily and socially. Right? And this is one of those things I'm trying to kind of, I hope will be applicable. It might resonate with some of you, so there's some nods going on. But I think that there's, luckily for all of us, there's lots of strains of white nonsense that we're all privy to, and so I think that this might apply. So before that, though, I want to talk about Corintha Mitchell. In this amazing piece that she wrote called Identifying White Mediocrity and Know Your Place Aggression, a Form of Self-Care. This is a long quote, but I'll leave it for you here. She says midway through that I define Know Your Place aggression as the flexible, dynamic array of forces that answer the achievements of marginalized groups, such that their success brings aggression as often as praise. Any progress by those who are not straight, white, and male is answered by a backlash of violence, both literal and symbolic, both physical and discursive, that essentially says, know your place. It is important to identify this tradition because cultural critics should help the nation remain clear about what did and did not fuel the election of this far less than mediocre man. Targeted communities and their allies must understand that the country did not arrive at this political, social, and moral juncture because people of color and other marginalized groups did something wrong, but rather because they were succeeding at claiming space as citizens. Not as privileged citizens, but simply as people who believe they belong. For anyone other than a straight white man, success often inspires aggression, and the accomplishment need not be monumental or spectacular to inspire large-scale and extremely hostile backlash. So, with that said, I want to think now about how that might apply to other contexts, like being in the university. Here I have a picture of Sarah Ahmed and being included. And I want to think about her notion of diversity, partially because now it's all the rage, but there's also pre-modern notions of a kind of value, positive ascription to diversity, and I think that's one of the things that the Jesuits are responsible for, partially the kind of globalizing impulse, but also to incorporate different cultures into this kind of broader sense of Catholic Christendom. So I think that in terms of what they're trying to do, it resonates with what Ahmed says here about changing perceptions of whiteness can be how an institution can reproduce whiteness as that which exists but is no longer perceived. And I'd like to suggest that the Japaneseness of these boys, these malleable figures, is really central to that kind of shifting perception. Similarly, she talks about institutions as kinship technologies. I think we're participating in one now, hopefully. But I think that what's most important here is this last part, where she says that recruitment functions as a technology for the reproduction of whiteness, and we can recall that Althusser's model of ideology is based on recruitment. And here I'm thinking too about, again, what it means to kind of enter in the domain of whiteness and what it means to be bequeathed whiteness as a way to, in some ways, legitimize kind of expansion and evangelization in Japan specifically. So, I mentioned the undercommons, but also LePaperson's A Third University is in the back of my mind. I'm happy to talk more about that. And what I want to do now is basically think about kind of how a critical genealogy of these different structures might have installed and nourished white ignorance within the post-war university, even as we think about the pre-modern past. So, let's move on. Part 3, Racist Jesuit Poetics and the Serviceable Japanese Boy. So this is the part I think that I was invited for, to talk about this old Japanese stuff. So, but first I had to talk about my feelings, because you all did it. Just to kind of frame things a little bit, I'm really trying to think about and consider the relationship between language and world making. After thinking about folks like Sylvia Wynter specifically. And so I'm trying to take, in some ways, in this very short period of time, a grammarian's approach to kind of think about kind of different figures of discourse that are operative in this kind of colonial encounter. What I'm trying to do is to better understand the poetics of racial imagination as it underpins and motivates evangelization in the late medieval world. So, this is some work that I'm pursuing in a new book project called Spectacular Dominion, Slavery, Performance, and the Boundaries of Personhood in Pre-Modern Japan. And in that context, just to give you a brief overview, this is, go, right, oh, it's moving quickly, sorry. Not sure why. Well, it's divided into 3 main sections. One is on remedial no plays about slavery. Oh. Sorry. Not sure what this is. Okay. Next one. The next one, please, is fine, actually, yeah. There we go, great. Yeah, this one. The second moment is about the Jesuit slave trade, which I'll talk more about today. And the third moment is Perry's 1853 opening of Japan. And here there's a wood block print of Perry's Ethiopian minstrels, so white crew members who black up, as it were, to perform. And the question here is, of what use, diplomatic use, is blackface in the context of kind of gunboat diplomacy? Why do you need performance in this context, and what does that say about the drive to pre-social Darwinism to kind of perform to the Japanese the superiority of white people by using figures of blackness? So along these lines, I have in mind a video that NHK, or the main kind of broadcasting station in Japan, put up after, in the context of summer of a couple years ago, after the George Floyd protests, that was designed as a kind of didactic cartoon for Japanese kids primarily, in which there's a ventriloquized voice of an angry black man in this undershirt casting aspersions at this blameless Tucker Carlson-esque figure on the side here. And if those of you that might not read Japanese, at the bottom here, what he's complaining about is not state-sanctioned violence, but rather the wealth gap between black and white people. So what I'm thinking about here is the ways in which Japanese media takes up, in an aspirational whiteness even, a certain form of white ignorance in terms of kind of recasting or mischaracterizing the reasons for social unrest as part of its pedagogical program. We see our pimpish friend on the side here, for some reason, who was playing music during this ordeal, and I think it's important to think about this kind of figure in terms of this longer genealogy and iconography of anti-black iconography that stems from the 19th century at least. So that's all to lead us even further back to Sylvia Wynter's 1492, New Worldview. And what I find most valuable about Wynter here is her effort to rethink and dismantle the genre of man. So to Fred Moten's quote from last night, which was invoked, fuck the human, that's capital H human, right? This notion of post-Enlightenment thought that would kind of reify a certain kind of version of humanity that has to be white, has to be enshrined in that particular way. And what she says about 1492, particularly the things that are happening around that time, like broader global expansion and primitive accumulation, is a root expansion of thought and this notion of the propter nos, or what belongs to us. Here are some images that might be useful, just trying to think about what the notion of the world was at that time. And I really want to kind of have us think seriously about the fact that Winter, one of the things that's really useful for my project is that she really emphasizes the extent to which, for Columbus, Marco Polo's embellished kind of descriptions of Sipangu, or this kind of silver isle, that this kind of exotic kind of place, was really the driving force, right? So of course you had material concerns like ships and military apparatus and so forth, but that imaginative work that language was doing to drive that journey is really first and foremost. Okay. Another image here, I think there's a laser that's not working, so I'm going to keep going, just to kind of orient us a little bit. Okay. And here, just to kind of get us situated, here's a timeline so you understand what we're talking about when I'm talking about kind of the Jesuit experience in Japan. Jesuits are eventually crucified, and I mean not just them, but also kind of Christian followers in Japan en masse. The 26 martyrs of Nagasaki, some of you might know about the kind of hidden Christians and so forth. But I'm interested most in this moment, for the purposes of today, that moment circa 1590, on the tail end of a kind of world tour where 4 Japanese boys have been trained as Christian converts, and Valignano sends them to Europe on a kind of tour to show effectively how successful Christianization has happened in Japan, how successfully that's been. And here, I really want to think about Morrison's notion of serviceability, not of an Africanist presence, but of these kind of Japanese boy bodies as being kind of pliable, malleable ideologically, but also spiritually. And the work that's being gone to kind of show them off in Europe as, on the one hand, kind of proof, living proof. They're described as cartas vivas, or kind of living letters that attest to the Jesuits' success in converting them, but then also what it means for Europeans to see in some ways the truth of their superiority reflected through this kind of yellow person. So here are some images from screens from the Namban period, or the Southern Barbarian period. And you'll notice, for instance, lots of figures of darker pigmentation. This is from the late 16th century. I'll show you some close-ups. These are really fascinating documents, first of all, because although we can certainly see images of figures who are darker and some seem to be in positions of, there we go, servitude. These could be Africans or kind of South Asians or Malay people. It's unclear exactly. One of the things I just want to notice here about the pre-modern period is that all of these figures are caricatured in some way. So there is not necessarily a kind of overt kind of anti-blackness being represented, but it is important to kind of think about, at this moment at least, there is a kind of contingency that all of these folks are experiencing, at least from the eyes of the Japanese artists who are representing them. Some other images of folks that you can see. Not sure what this is. You go to the next slide, sorry. Great. A little more. Yeah. Okay. See. Yeah. All right. So the larger kind of question here is about kind of, for me as a performance studies scholar and medievalist, is kind of what types of rhetorical and physical gestures characterize competing performances of masculine personhood staged between Asia, Europe, and the New World during early modern Jesuit expansion. And along these lines, how did confronting Japanese styles of comportment solidify or unsettle European phenotypical hierarchies and religious ideologies? And the Jesuits' experience is a great place to look for those things. So here's Xavier, just an image that you see our main protagonist, and the ways in which the Jesuits, they're situated in the middle, and the black robes themselves are kind of really struggling to kind of seem to be worthy of respect in terms of this kind of really erect posture, etc. So this is a kind of broader question about kind of self-presentation that I think, and an anxiety about which actually kind of carries over into the situation where we have, right, Valignano, who is the leader of the Jesuit mission in Japan and the writer of a treatise that I'm going to kind of read a bit from here to kind of close out. So just to kind of give a sense, we talked a lot about monstrosity yesterday, helpfully, and I just want you to notice in this context, to the Japanese at least, these were less than human people. These were monsters. The Europeans did not, were not kind of viewed with particular reverence by the Japanese, and we tend to forget that when we're kind of being presentist and kind of retrospectively ascribing these things, but they were animals, just to say. And animals partially because of their ignorance of Japanese customs, their refusal to bathe more than once a week, et cetera, et cetera. So keep that in mind. So heading towards the conclusion here. So this is an image. You'll see a woodblock kind of engraving of the four boys and their chaperone here, arranged in this. We can talk more about kind of the aesthetics of what it means to have this rectilinear format, what it means to have them dressed as Europeans on the one hand, but still racially marked potentially, to hold the crown, to have that seal, that imprimatur of being kind of co-signed by the Jesuits and so forth. But I really want to notice the fact that in this context, there's still, despite this notion of Japanese being kind of white compared to, right? Sorry, next one, please. White compared to Africans or Indians, there's also a sense of them being racially ambiguous. And here's the quote I want to read. Oh, sorry. Go back one. Go back one, sorry. No, sorry. Great. Let's just stay here. Let's just stay here. And I'll put this away. Sorry about that. In this context, what we're talking about actually is the slide that was elided here talked about the Japanese boys being kind of associated with being African or Indian. There's a kind of ambiguity here, and that ambiguity, I suggest, is actually partially what makes them so attractive. But at the beginning of this document that I find really particularly interesting, it's called A Dialogue Concerning the Mission of the Japanese Ambassadors to the Roman Curia. It's dated 1590. And in it, what's happening effectively is that Valignano is staging a dialogue between the boys in the form of a kind of catechism, but it's actually a monologue. And this is part of what I want to think about in terms of poetics today, is like what drives a man to insist that, or to kind of stage effectively as a ventriloquist, these different kinds of interactions as though they are being said by real live people. He says at one point here, "You have to persuade yourselves, therefore," he's talking to the boys, "that is no foreigner that you're listening to, but that it's your own people who are speaking. In that sense, they were not able to talk to everyone and tell them about Europe. They are now gladly communicating to the whole nation of Japan in this dialogue, everything that they learned in the whole of their journey." Next slide, please. And in this journey, they talk, among other things, about slavery. And this is what they say. "So there's no Christian who is legally held as a slave among Christians because he's been captured in war. Absolutely no one is deprived of his rights in this way. And as I said, there's a definite and ancient custom to that effect. The Portuguese indeed and all the Europeans marvel to see our people so avaricious, so greedily intent on amassing money, that they sell each other, and sully the name of Japan with a mark of infamy. We ourselves often at various points in our journey saw Japanese men who had been sold and condemned to slavery and found ourselves unable to contain a deep and burning anger against our own people, who for such a vile price heartlessly hand over their countrymen, though of the same blood and language, as if they were cattle or beast of burden." Could you go two ahead, and then I'll close, I think. Great. Right here. That would be great. So, at the end of this dialogue, Michael, one of the feigned Japanese boys, says, "It's not the Portuguese who are at fault. They are merchants, so they cannot be blamed if they buy our people with the hope of gain and later make a profit by selling them in India and other places. It is entirely our people who are at fault, who for a small payment so easily allow even their own children, whom they ought dearly to cherish, to be torn from their mother's bosom. With regard to the fathers of the society, if you were to understand how strongly opposed they are to this kind of selling and buying, you should also know that with care and diligence they obtained from the King of Portugal a royal letter prohibiting any merchant under severe penalty from coming to Japan and buying a Japanese slave." So this is a lot of white nonsense on display here. But the point here, I think, at the end, one more ahead, if you don't mind. Oh, sorry. Is that he says at the very end of that, the Europeans, because they always have the common good before their eyes, never permit these vicious customs to be introduced in their kingdoms, but let us revert to the theme of our talk. So there's a little ellipsis here in the text in which this is described, and what happens in this context is that the Japanese boys effectively become apologists for Portuguese slavery. And I'm particularly interested because this seems to me like a willful dissimulation of the missionary situation. It is, to say the least, an aspirational text in positing a world in which Christian missionaries can do no wrong, and Japanese converts brim with gratitude for the opportunity to bask in God's glorious favor. So, to conclude, what I hope to have shown a little bit of today is the serviceability of a certain kind of figure of Japanese boyhood within the context of this kind of moral and religious economy that's being fostered by the Jesuits. One of the things that interests me most about this dialogue/monologue is the way that a certain kind of racialized logic also becomes a question of form in terms of oohing and eyeing at these kind of new kind of revelations by the Jesuits, but then also the ways in which Japanese boys are invoked to legitimize and even routinize white nonsense along within a broader kind of sphere. These kind of observations that they're making about the way the world works are kind of posed as being natural observations by credible interlocutors. And that's exactly the thing that allows white ignorance to fester. So along these lines, I have in mind work by Denise Ferreira da Silva about affectability and the ways in which this kind of dispassionate kind of dialogue and all the kind of poetic things that go along with it are actually so central to kind of fostering a sense of white ignorance that we inherit as scholars today when we're looking back to the past, but we're also trying to figure out exactly where we stand, what kind of epistemological kind of obstacles we might encounter. So hopefully that's helpful. I look forward to kind of your discussion. I apologize for the technical difficulties in advancing the slides. And my question to end with is, how might we metabolize white ignorance to perform liberating work? Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions. I think we probably went over time a bit. I apologize, but
we have a couple of minutes for. Oh my gosh, we have a couple minutes for questions. So yeah, Roy.
Hi, thank you for this super amazing, wide-ranging talk. My question, I think, is about the Jesuits and whiteness. Because it's the 1580s and the 1590s, and you know that like the Jesuits are trying to creep back into England after being expelled by Elizabeth, do you think this sort of like world making that's happening in Japan is like this sort of reclamation of whiteness? Because, you know, blackness in Jesuit sometimes gets elided in like the 1580s. Is this a way to kind of like re-whitewash themselves in order to come back and like conquer England again?
Yeah, interesting. No, thank you for that. I mean, I think it's not time to kind of go into it, but I think it's really interesting to me that kind of English or kind of broader European, England in particular, but with the kind of the rise of the Protestants and the ways in which kind of their ascendancy is actually really freaking the Jesuits out. I mean, Catholics more broadly, but less so Dominican orders, I think. And so there is this kind of move, I think, by the Jesuits to reassert a certain kind of relevance, to prove to the Pope or the kind of the Holy See that they are the ones that have the answers, they're the ones that can be most successful. And so they basically kind of insisted on a monopoly on Japan and kind of cut out the Franciscans and Dominicans. Maybe some of you guys know this, right? It's so nice to be able to not have to kind of like, contextualize all of that. So I think that there is, people are just like, yeah, of course, yeah, no, this is kind of internecine struggle among Christians in Europe, yeah, of course. So I think that's part of it. I think that along those lines, the racial politics are kind of complicated. I mean, I think that what's also happening here, importantly, I think in terms of sexuality, is that, at this time, male-male love as a kind of foundational social practice in Japan is also, completely widespread, and kind of the sin of sodomy is really something that, as it happens, the Jesuits don't write back home about too much, right? So that kind of suppression is also in some ways about kind of preserving a certain kind of racial purity, I think, and to kind of get away from this kind of notion of barbarism. And I think that exactly because of this proximity to whiteness that the Jesuits really rely on to get funded effectively. I mean, they're looking for a good return on investment. And so much of what's key about this notion of whiteness as it relates to the Japanese, in some ways, is the lack of labor it will take to convert them. So as opposed to what happens in the New World, as opposed to kind of the massive expense and so forth, it's kind of Japanese, more cultured, more obedient, kind of phenotypically white folks become more valuable as a rhetorical device to kind of get more funding from the papacy. So it's a slight kind of divergence from your topic, but I think that with that increased funding and that release, that kind of increased respect from the Holy See, that there is a sense of trying to kind of to be more dominant within that European sphere.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm always interested to think of that wide range, almost, unstoppable busyness of the Jesuits, because as someone from Haudenosaunee territory, they were very busy in the 17th century in our place. And since you invoked 1492 as a kind of signal date, I was thinking it would be interesting to bring this more in conversation between the two because of their difference with the Americas. And I think one of the things of racialization that interests me in the North American context with the Haudenosaunee is whereas Japan represents a cohesive and recognizable polity and state to them in a way that kind of overwhelming considering their presence, there's a presumption of lack of sovereignty, lack of state polity in their interactions with us. So when they come to our territory, they come with a deed presenting them the land from the King of France, right? So where there's no negotiation with us, there's no sense that, and they set up a mission in Onondaga territory that lasts only about 11 months, and yet is memorialized in upstate New York as the first Catholic mission to that part of the Americas. And I'm like, 11 months? I have shoes older than 11 months. It's not a thing to memorialize, and they were quickly driven out and never have had an effect. The Onondaga never became Catholic and so on. They made much more inroads among my own people as Mohawks. But so I'm interested in that racialized sense of sovereignty and what they do with that, and just trying to bring that back into conversations. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, and I appreciate that for so many reasons. And I'm deeply ignorant of that context. This is, I'm in deeper water with the Jesuits. I mainly work with kind of no drama and calligraphy and earlier things. But no, I agree. I mean, I think that one of the things that's really important to remember with the Japanese case is that, functionally, whatever, it's not a state in the even early modern sense, but they had a monopoly on violence. And that makes the difference. I mean, it's that there is no, and indeed there's kind of debate within the the kind of Jesuit community. So someone like Cabral, the kind of extra macho Spaniard, effectively is like, just come in here with the galleons and kind of kick ass, take names, and kind of show them, and that doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't work partially because it's too dangerous, but also it's very clear that that strategy of just kind of brute conquest that worked in other places is not going to work in this context. And so what it means then is this is where in some ways this kind of this work around self-presentation, around trying to kind of win them over, has to kind of come about, right? Because it's exactly because there is no, if you mess with them, and this is what is the history of, it's longer than 11 months, but when all of those Christians are martyred, and they start putting up these edicts that say if you stomp on this kind of image of the Virgin Mary to prove that you're not Christian, or else we're going to lop your head off. Like, that's helpful. It's helpful because one of the things it means then is that foothold is impossible, and there is a de facto then because of the violence that's so imminent, that I think kind of forestalls any of those kinds of questions about kind of sovereignty, and that might kind of appear in a different context. So I absolutely agree that it would be great to look more at that. I'm happy to talk more about that with you. And yeah, I mean, I'm interested in how the Jesuits fail all over the world, actually. So I think that kind of a genealogy of that failure as it relates to sovereignty would be really interesting. Yeah.
This was a beautiful talk, and I love paintings, by the way. That was just great. I want to ask about the Japanese boys. Specifically, it seems to me that the Japanese boys claim that the Portuguese merchants aren't to blame because they couldn't help but do this. At the one hand, feels like a logic of necessity, but on the other hand, almost feels dehumanizing. And I'm thinking about how those who are racialized as non-white often perform white nonsense better than white people. Like, there's a kind of extremity of performance of white nonsense. We've been seeing a lot of this over the last couple days. And I'm wondering how we understand the way that non-white people perform nonsensical white epistemologies, and how those benefits, and I think we're seeing this with EDI initiatives, those benefits look like they're being given to us, and then they are instantly taken away once it becomes inconvenient to incorporate.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the connection to kind of current, events. I mean, I mentioned the people I mentioned because of exactly that kind of connection. And, on the one hand, tokenism is one thing, right? Insincere appeals to equity, inclusion, and so forth, diversity in different ways. Those are not new. But, I think that there is something to be said for, what we might call, if you're kind of good post-Marxist, the intensification of that, of non-white actors, partially, because it's lucrative, right? I mean, this is the Eric Adams case. He's kind of par excellence, what it means to, long after Clarence Thomas, it's like what it means to invoke a certain kind of, or perform a certain kind of marginalized identity for the sake of accruing capital and kind of prestige and so forth. So I'm thinking about that a lot. I mean, if we're talking about, the 5 black cops who are, right, doing a hell of a job, then, I think, or the Chauvin case, how do we understand this kind of what it means? And I think that this is where Derricka Purnell's work is really helpful. Because one of the things she talks about is understanding, like, the appeal at a level of, insofar as one has, been shut out of certain jobs, like what it means to have these kind of jobs in the civil, post office jobs, cop jobs, because they're more stable. And what does that mean then when one is expected to kind of preserve the pillars of capitalism, and you have to make a choice, right? And that train sadly is never late. So I think that it's worth looking at these different moments in history. This is part of what I'm glad to be here, partially because for me that connection is very much intact. That's front of mind. And kind of spelling out all the steps, to why that would be the case is not necessary with this particular group of folks, so I'm grateful to you for that. The intensification, I think, is, partially because of racial misery, I think it's partially because, the kind of the embattled identity of cops now, kind of entail, fragile masculinity, like what kind of rubric do we want to use? It's all of those things that I think makes people feel as though they have to assert themselves. And this is where, it's like James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, and Sylvia Wynter, it's like folks that are, rarely if ever wrong. I kind of went back to the last slide is actually a kind of quotation from, could you go back to that just to kind of have it up? From her essay, NHI, Letter to My Colleagues, so No Humans Involved, which I'd also recommend if people haven't read. It was written in the wake of the Rodney King beatings and trial, and it refers to this kind of designation by police that NHI means No Humans Involved, which is to say that if there are black folks who were killed, that they didn't count effectively. And she's trying to kind of historicize this. And I think, like most of her stuff, it's incredibly prescient. Which I don't think she anticipated to the same degree. And this is not Sylvia. And I mean, like, who am I? But it's like, but I think what's interesting is that the kind of pervasive nature of that, right, in terms of the kind of resurgence of right-wing nationalism, how that intersects with these kind of broader kind of systems of discipline and control within, say, the inner city. I think that that kind of convergence is something that we haven't, I mean, there are versions of it, but right now I think that's something that's new that needs to be theorized kind of further. And there are people like Simone Brown, there are people like, I mean, there's tons of folks that are doing really interesting work around surveillance and kind of what that means, but I'm just sad and rambling now, but let's talk more about that. So, anything else? No? Okay. Sorry.
All right. What I think Reginald just modeled so brilliantly is that even though the talk and the Q&A ends, the conversation continues. So can we give Reginald a huge round of applause?
Thank you all so much. Thank you for your patience.